Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being with me today. This afternoon, we're talking about Motivation 101, a blueprint for unlocking your child's motivation. I'm Ann Dolan, and for the last 26 years, my team of subject tutors, test prep tutors, executive function coaches, and college consultants have been helping kids to do better in school, ultimately to get into the college of their choice, but along the way, supporting kids to learn lifelong strategies for staying motivated, being organized, planning ahead, and managing their time effectively. I can't think of anybody better to discuss this topic of motivation with me than Kathy Gold. Kathy, thank you so much for being with me this afternoon.
Hi, Anne. I'm so happy to be here and to talk about this really important issue.
Terrific, Kathy. Well, let me give you some background on Kathy. She's a program specialist here with me at Educational Connections. And that means that every day she talks to parents about their kids, their needs, how we can best help. And then she matches them with just the right coach or tutor. She specializes in working with kids and families, with students with executive function issues and ADHD. She, before she came on as her role in our administrative staff, she was a tutor and an executive function coach with us. Prior to that, she was in the Connecticut public school system for 27 years as a teacher. Kathy has a master's degree in education and a 6-year in educational leadership. So Kathy, before we get into the nitty-gritty, let's talk about what motivation is in the first place. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. And I'm so glad that we're having this conversation today, Anne, because when I talk to parents every day, all day, motivation always comes up. So it's important for us to all have a common ground understanding of what that means. So when we talk about motivation, we're talking about a general desire or willingness of someone to do something. And I think willingness is the key term there, especially when we're dealing with adolescents, because sometimes parents think they're not very willing, right? Motivation propels us to engage in goal-directed behavior. So that means that it pushes us forward in order to take whatever action steps are necessary to meet a goal. And it provides us with a reason to act in a certain way. And I think, Anne, you and I both know as adults, we have plenty of moments where we are not motivated also, but we can kind of intellectualize it and understand that at the end of the day, things need to get done, even if it's a non-preferred task. But that's a lot harder for younger people and the students with whom we work.
Yes, Kathy, you're right. It sure is. And one of the oldest theories about motivation actually comes from Maslow. Tell us why this hierarchy is still important, almost 100 years later.
Yeah, and this is a well-known hierarchy, and it has to do with basic human needs and our success or contentment with our lives. But what you have to think about with this is that, there are different levels of needs on this pyramid, basically. And what we have to be aware of is if any of these needs are not being met, it's very, very difficult for students to be motivated. So if you even think of the lower three rows there, so physiological, safety, and love and belonging, those are things like, does a student have shelter? Does a student have food? Is a student in a safe location, either at home or maybe the student's being bullied at school? Does the student feel loved and part of a group, like a peer group or a school community? These are basic human needs. And if these aren't being met, it's extremely difficult for a student to be motivated to then participate in the classroom.
Yes, for sure. And when it comes to motivation, there's also different types.
Absolutely. So basically there are three types. The first is intrinsic, and this is the one that we all wish we had, right? So you're intrinsically motivated, meaning it's coming from within you. So you're just that driven type of person. You're wired that way. If something needs to get done, you're going to do it. Okay. And some of us kind of ebb and flow out of intrinsic motivation at different times of the year or different times of the day. People that are extrinsically motivated are very motivated by something outside of themselves. So if you're trying to reach a goal and you're going to give yourself a little reward for getting there, or if positive praise from a boss or a teacher or a colleague, that motivates you, that's extrinsic. And then we have amotivation, and this is a lack of either. So this is where a lot of our students come to us for a multitude of reasons that we're going to get into in the presentation today. But if a student is amotivated, it means they don't appear to have any motivation. And this is when parents call me and they're really concerned and frustrated.
One of my favorite theories around motivation is the self-determination theory. And it really speaks to me as a parent, as a former teacher, because it really helps us to understand, why are some kids more motivated than others? And then why are some kids maybe not so motivated in academics, but maybe super motivated in baseball? Can you talk a little bit about these three factors?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is sort of an overview. We're going to go into more detail about each of these in our presentation today. But in order to feel motivated, human beings need these three things. So you need to have autonomy. You need to have a feeling that you have a choice in the matter. And we can all relate to this, right? No one likes having something done to them or being told what to do. We all like to have a say in a decision. Relatedness is another important one. So in order to feel motivated, we need to feel connected to what we're learning, or connected to a group or a community, or have some kind of belonging in general. So again, imagine a student who doesn't see the reason behind why do I have to take an algebra class, right? It's really hard for them to get motivated. And then the last one is competence. So mastery or success in your activity. This makes perfect sense outside of school as well as in. So imagine yourself in the classroom. For me, it was math in high school. I was a terrible math student. I struggled. I didn't understand. I had big skill gaps, I found out later on. And that was why I was not motivated to go home and do the work on my own. Or think of a sport that you've participated in. If you keep going to that, tennis court or ball field and you're not finding any success, it's very defeating, right? And it's hard to stay motivated to persevere.
Kathy, I can relate to you with the math example. I felt like that starting in elementary school. I really struggled with it. And I started to develop a motivation problem because it was just so hard for me because I didn't have competence in it, or good enough competence. And it started as I got older to bleed over into other areas. And I see that happening with kids, especially our kids that have ADHD or weak executive function skills, because school all around is a little bit harder for them. But the good news is there are specific things we can do for those students. Can you talk a little bit about why they may appear to be challenged with motivation a little bit more and what we can do about it?
Yeah, and this is so important for us to recognize, Anne, because again, I speak to parents all day, every day, and many of the parents call and they have students with ADHD. My own 29-year-old son has ADHD, so I have experienced this as a mother as well as an educator. Plenty of people call us to just have weak executive function skills without a diagnosis. But if those things are happening, there are some real physiological brain wiring issues that make it that much harder. So one of them is that if a student has an ADHD diagnosis, they have physiological lower levels of dopamine. And that's the brain chemistry that says to us, come on, let's go, right? If you have less of that, you need more of a catalyst or more of a push to get moving. Which brings us to the next bullet point, which is students with ADHD need a greater incentive to change their behavior. So what might motivate a neurotypical student does not necessarily motivate a student with ADHD. So they have to try that much harder. They also find postponing gratification very challenging. So for example, if you find completing a task very satisfying, like if I say, I need to clean my room, and when I finish cleaning the room, that makes me very happy, right? Students with ADHD can't wait till the project is done. They need to have little check-ins along the way. And the last piece that makes this tricky is there's something called task paralysis, or sometimes we call it ADHD freeze. So a student with ADHD may look at a task that someone else sees as seemingly simple and become absolutely frozen and paralyzed by it because it looks overwhelming, it's too big, there's too many moving parts, and they don't know where to start. So you can imagine with all these things working against you, how difficult it might be to sit down and study for that math test on a Tuesday night when your favorite Netflix show is on, right?
Yeah, kind of going back to your point about a non-preferred task. Certainly we see that with task paralysis and the freeze issue. So what's the answer? How do we help kids that have these issues?
Yeah. So these are things that can be done at home or in an academic setting. I'll give you an example. When we work with students as coaches, what we do is we start by restructuring the task. So let's take the example of a student who's sitting down with a coach and has a 5-paragraph essay for English class, and they are frozen. They're anxious, they're frustrated. So the coach is going to help the student to restructure the task. And that might involve breaking it into very small, manageable pieces. and then spreading that out over time. So, on what day and at what time are you going to do each piece of the task? So it's not, you have to write a 5-paragraph paper. It's all you have to do right now is come up with your thesis statement. And then all you have to do in the next couple of minutes is come up with your supporting reasons, right? So little pieces at a time. Also add an element of fun. And again, you could do this at home with your student by turning something into a game, or coaches will do it. They'll play music. Typically music without lyrics is the best because it's not distracting, or they'll gamify something in some way. Another way they sometimes, make it a little more exciting and fun is they'll allow the student to choose a different medium. So instead of using, for example, a paper flashcards, they'll say, let's create some digital flashcards in some way that are a little more colorful, attractive, and kind of get that dopamine surging some more. Another trick is adding small and frequent incentives. So if I go back to my essay example, if I'm a coach working with a student, I might give the student a little tiny reward for each part. So you write your thesis statement, you've got 3 minutes. You can go downstairs, you can get a snack, you can come back up. Or, you get the thesis statement done, you've got 3 minutes to watch your favorite YouTube video, and then we'll get back to work. So having little incentives and rewards along the way is much more effective for this student than making them wait till the end. And then the last one doesn't work for everyone, but sometimes external pressure helps. So that might be in a setting, again, either at home with your own child or in a session with a tutor or a coach. Maybe you time them. Maybe you make it a race. So when I was coaching with students, I would say, okay, we're both going to go through this list of 10 vocabulary words. Let's set the timer and see who finishes first. So make it a little competitive. That works for some kids.
It sounds like, whatever strategy you use, you first have to understand what's causing the issue. And for that reason, in a sense, you kind of have to peel back the onion. Would you say that's the case, Kathy?
Yeah, this is a perfect analogy. So it's really important for us to get at what is going wrong. So in that, why aren't they motivated piece? And there are many reasons. We talked about the ADHD piece. It might be a student that has perfectionistic tendencies, so they're afraid to start at all. But one of the things I've realized as a program manager is I'll be on the phone with a parent and they start out by saying they're not motivated, they don't want to try, they just don't seem to care, that kind of thing. And as the conversation evolves, I hear them mention that, for example, geometry is a big pain point for them. And I hear it over and over. And finally, we get to the root of that. And what we realize is that maybe the student has some real skill gaps in geometry and they don't know what to do. They're not just not trying. They literally don't know the content area. So sometimes that's the very first step is we have to get at, is it, and even I want to say, is it as simple as a content area issue? That might not be super simple. They still need some kind of support. But if it's that's influencing everything else, we need to look at that first.
Yeah, for sure. So let's talk about why we're all here. And that's really, how do you motivate an unmotivated student? So first, we have to determine, is it an executive function issue? Are there content difficulties? We see this a lot in strategy or in subjects that require a lot of working memory, like writing and math. But once we kind of figure that out, we really want to focus on the process more than the outcome. Why is it important to not really focus as much on, did you, get 100 on that test, but the effort that goes into it?
Yeah. And I'm sure you're familiar with the old saying, it's not the destination, it's the journey, right? So when we focus on the process, we're focusing on all of those skills that students learn to acquire: perseverance, grit, determination, discipline sometimes, right? That will eventually get them to an endpoint. But for a parent, it might be noticing something your student is doing. Let's say they play soccer, and you might say, you know what? I'm really proud of you because I've noticed that every day this week, you've been ready to go at 4 o'clock with your bag packed for soccer. That's great. Or they might say, you know what? I saw last night that you sat right down right after dinner and you started your homework. They're not saying, fantastic, you finished all your homework, or you scored a goal in the soccer game. They're saying, I'm so proud of those little steps that you took to get there, right? A coach, on the other hand, working with a student might say to a student, wow, I'm really impressed that you came to the session today with some questions for me. That shows some forethought. That shows some planning. That's a great effort by you. Or, I might say, I noticed that you're using one of the apps that we introduced last week. I am so proud of you for trying something new that might be outside your comfort zone. So you're recognizing those, what might look like little tiny steps, but that's how we make progress.
And one of the parents just put in a question, Kathy, and said, what if the issue is more about anxiety or perfectionism, and you still want to focus on the process for sure? What are some things that you might notice as a process-based behavior for a student who's maybe a perfectionist?
Yeah, often students that are perfectionists are so afraid of making a mistake or completing something in a way that doesn't meet their own expectations that can't start at all, right? So that's where the process is so important, because if we can get them to take one baby step in the right direction, that more will follow, right? So we have to, think about when you're driving your car in the snow and you're starting to go up a hill and the wheels are spinning, and then they finally catch, then you're good to go, right? But sometimes that initial spinning wheels is what we have to work through with students that are either anxious or perfectionistic in their approach to their work.
I like that analogy. All right, so autonomy, that's important too. And we want to give kids some leeway in doing things their way. But sometimes there's a fine line, because at the same time, we want to make sure our kids are turning in their work and they're actually getting things done. How do you find that balance?
Yeah. This one's important. And I think in the home, well, first of all, autonomy is very developmentally appropriate for middle school and high school students, right? For us as adults to pay attention to that. It's really important for students of this age to be able to make their own decisions and to feel like they have a say in what's happening in their own lives, right? So at home, you might start with coming up with plans for the family all together. So everyone has a say in what's going to happen. So let's take the example of the family dog, right? So someone has to feed the dog, right? And you don't want to say to your student, you have to do it, or there's multiple siblings and the children are going to say, how come I always have to do it? He never has to do it, right? But you might say, for example, who's going to feed the dog? Or maybe, do you want to feed the dog in the morning or at night? So then the student has a choice, and one sibling will say, okay, I'll take the morning feeding. And the other student says, okay, I'll take the night. So the dog is still getting fed, right? But they've had a choice in what works best for their day or their schedule. You can also ask students, let's say it's a weekend and they have a soccer practice, but they also have homework. You might say, okay, kiddo, what's your plan? You got a lot going on this weekend. How do you see this all getting done? What's going to work for you? So you're not saying to them, you have to sit down at 3 o'clock and start to study. You're acknowledging they have a lot on their plate. You're there to support them, but you're letting them decide. So that's really important. And with a coach, if I'm sitting down with a student, I might say, hey, Jane, you know what? You have 2 assignments that we need to look at today. Which one should we start first, right? So again, give the student the choice. Or I might say, looks like you've got some really complex text in your history book that you have to get through. Probably note-taking is going to be a good idea for us. You and I have worked on 2 column notes and Cornell notes. Which one's a better fit for you? Which one do you want to use today? So you're never given the option of not doing the task, but you're always giving a choice.
I love that, Kathy, because kids feel more invested in the solution and they take greater responsibility if they're part of the discussion. That's
Absolutely.
for sure.
Yeah.
I like the question you asked. Oh, tell me about your plan. Because even if the child isn't, as a parent, even if the child isn't overly verbal, like, oh, gee, mom, well, let's see, I'm going to do this, that, and the other thing, it still does fire up their executive function skills, because it's making them think forward. Like, oh, okay, well, I'm going to do this and that. Even if they think of a hierarchy of 2 things, that's, getting them in the right frame of mind. But you're right, in a coaching session, they're always more verbose and they're going to give you more information. That's for sure. So part of that discussion is really promoting empathetic communication and understanding where kids are coming from, so that, especially as parents, it's not a confrontation. Like, I told you to study for this. You said you did. How did you get a C? Or why haven't you done your homework? What have you been doing up there for 2 hours? Then it can be more like a confrontation, which does not promote motivation. Tell us how we make it a little bit more conversational and come from a position of empathy, both as a parent and in the work you do.
Yeah. And as a parent too, I think the word in this bullet that's so important is the empathetic, right? So we want our children, we want our students to know that we understand, we have been in their shoes, right? So if you can make it, again, conversational, not confrontational. So good questions are really important, and we're going to get to that. Keep it a very open dialogue. You're not lecturing. You're letting the student know that you get it, that you've been there, you understand, and naming the feeling. So I find a lot, with my own kids or with students, if I can say, well, how are you feeling right now? And they might say, I'm angry, or I'm, frustrated, or I'm, mad, whatever it is. It's okay. Okay. So let's just sit in that for a little bit. Yeah, I get it. I don't like when I feel anxious either, or I don't like when I'm angry with my friends either. I understand that. As teachers and as parents, we can't always erase all the negative feelings that our students are having, right? So sometimes we have to just say, let's talk about it, put it on the table, and then we're going to be able to move past it. Yeah, I think that's probably the heart of it. And then we're going to get eventually, like I said, we're going to get into some questions, some more specific questions we can ask that help to sort of frame what this might look like.
Yeah, because this kind of goes to what Lori just asked. So when we're in conversation with our kids and they say something, we want to say something like, oh, tell me about that. Oh, tell me more. Because at that time, our goal is not to solve their problem. It's really to be a good listener and allow them to talk, because oftentimes they can solve the problems on their own. But aside from tell me about that, what are some questions that might be good for a parent in this case? Or a coach, Kathy?
Sure. So if your child comes home from school and they had an English quiz today, and then you might say, okay, so tell me about the quiz, and then what went well? I love that question, because not saying, what grade did you get? Did you finish? Were you prepared? Tell me about what went well. Let's always start with the positive, right? And then the student will be able to come up with something, right? And then even if there's something that, didn't go so perfectly, then you might, let's say, for example, they say, oh my gosh, I did really well in the vocabulary part, but I should have reread that short story because I couldn't remember the internal conflict of the plot. And then you might say, all right, well, what would you do differently next time? Right? So just put it on their plate. Don't say, well, you should have read the story again, right? Just let them figure it out. And then I love this last one is, how can I support you in the future, right? So as a parent, those are all very appropriate. And our coaches do the same kinds of things. Like, for example, at the end of a session, the coach might say, how do you think the session went today? What do you think you did well? Here's what I saw you do really well. Let me share that with you, right? And then we talked about some new strategies today. Which one do you see yourself using? And then why or why not? And that's getting into what we call metacognition, which is teaching the students to think about their thinking. So you're letting them decide what works best for them. You're not telling them. So sometimes our coaches might say, for example, it looks like, maybe we're struggling with tracking assignments. So here are a couple of options. Not you must use a paper planner, but you could use a paper planner if that works for you. But we've also got this great app on the phone, or we've got a running Google Doc in your computer. Which one do you want to use, right? So it just keeps it open. And again, the autonomy piece comes in. It's just a much more effective way of helping students to find their own way ultimately.
Kathy, Lori said, what if the child really rebels? This is so common. I know I've heard this as a coach. Kids will say, oh, Mrs. Dolan, I don't have anything to do. I did all of it. Or we'll log in together and I'll say, oh, can you show me your English class? And we'll say, that's so weird. I don't know why it's there. I already turned that in. How do you tackle those things?
Yeah, and that happens. And that is sometimes a matter of, with a parent, that can cause a dynamic that's uncomfortable, right? With a coach, sometimes over time, students will be less likely to sort of try that, right? But what happens sometimes, like when I was coaching and students came to me with that, and I'd say, okay, if that's the truth, like I believe you, but let's verify, right? So really dig deeper if you can. And then you might say to the student, look, this is up to you. You're not a little child. I'm sure you have the ability to make this decision, but I just want you to think about like cost versus benefit, right? So what's the cost of you saying you have no work right now? What's the benefit? Think about that. What's the cost of saying, all right, I might actually have an assignment that I need to do? And then what's the benefit of that? So if you can, again, you're not telling them they have to do something in a specific way or at a specific time, but you're saying, if you're making this choice, it might come back and it have a negative impact on you.
What about giving pep talks? I found that these don't really work as a parent and definitely as an educator, saying things like, you can do it, you've got it, or just do your best work, or you know what, when you go to class today, just pay attention, you can focus. So these haven't worked well for me as a parent or a teacher. What do you think about pep talks, Kathy?
Yeah, I have to agree with you. And kids really kind of see right through this because it sounds very generic to them. What you're saying to them, great job, or, good work. You could say that to anyone, right? It's almost like that, the new buzzword is toxic positivity, right? So you're almost undermining the student by not recognizing that they're uncomfortable or they're struggling with something. So a better approach is something called the 3 N's, right? So notice, name, and nourish. And when we do this, we notice when a child does something positive, you name what you notice and explain the value of it, and then you nourish that specifically. So I might say, for example, to a student, hey, Jared, I see you were trying really hard at your math problems. And I actually noticed that you tried a couple of extra ones without quitting. That shows me that you don't give up. I am so proud of your effort there. So they can't deny that you have specifically noticed when they made an effort. And that's much more powerful than the great job, right? Students know the difference.
I like that, especially the naming part. Like I know that you're not a quitter because now as a student, you think, oh, I am that kid. I'm not a quitter. Maybe I am in
Yes.
some things, but not here at this moment. And even though that's a small thing, that really makes kids feel good and feel motivated to do it again.
Yeah.
Kathy, what about rewards, big rewards and punishments?
Yeah, this one's so tempting, right? I remember when my kids were young, I have to confess, I was about rewards. You'll get an ice cream cone if so and so, right? But really, statistics show that these can work in the short term. So yes, you could motivate someone to do something if you offer them a big reward or something that they want, and even some kind of punishment, but it's never productive or successful long term. And it also it teaches the wrong lesson, right? So then you would never become intrinsically motivated if everything had a reward attached, a big reward attached to it. And the punishment piece, again, that's been proven, punishment, shame never ever motivates a student. So yes, you could get a student to do something that day, but it's not going to carry over. And we're going to talk, I think it's on our next slide where we talk about what's an alternative to the punishment, right?
Yes, for sure. Natural consequences seem to be a better approach. How have you found them to work in the sessions you've had with kids in the classroom, privately as an executive function coach, and as a parent too, Kathy?
Yeah. The natural consequences are the best, and they're not easy for parents. So I'm thinking back to when I decided that my baseball player needed to do his own laundry, and I wasn't gonna push him about it. I wasn't gonna stay on his back about it. But when he got on the baseball field in filthy, dirty baseball pants that were supposed to be white, and they were really grayish brown, and I had to face the sort of, horror of the other baseball moms. Like, how could you let him be on the field in those pants? That was a natural consequence. So it was painful for me. It was painful for him. And he actually started doing laundry at that point and I didn't have to say a word about it, right? But I think for students, it's the same thing. And I see when our coaches work with students, they write session notes after every session, and those get sent to the parent. So it's a kind of a digital running record of what the coach is doing with the student over the course of the time that they're working together. And the coaches are really honest, and they will write in the notes. Joseph was very honest with me in our session last night, and he shared that he chose to watch 2 hours of Netflix instead of studying for his quiz. And then when he got to his quiz today, he realized he wasn't prepared and he performed really poorly. And now he's kind of regretting that choice, right? So the coach doesn't judge, doesn't discipline, doesn't say, I told you so. She's just stating, or he just stating the obvious, right? This is what happens. And that helps the student, again, to understand that, yes, you always have a choice, but you're not necessarily exonerated from the consequences of your choices. So my son getting on the baseball field in gray pants, okay, that was a consequence for him. Or this student not performing well on an assessment, that's a natural consequence. And we all in life need to learn to roll with those types of little mini failures, right? And then get up and keep going.
And I like the point about mini failures. What we don't want to do is if the child's in complete distress, they're tanking across the board academically and say, you need to learn from this situation, from the hole you've dug for yourself. That doesn't work either because it's too extreme. The student doesn't know how to get out of that situation. And so can you talk a little bit, Kathy, about finding that happy medium, letting some things go, but also being a support mechanism if the student is really, really struggling?
Yeah, and certainly we're not here to let anyone suffer or to defeat the student. Our role is to build the student up, right? But I think one of the things that works a lot is just keeping, again, when we go back to that slide about the empathetic communication, right? Keeping it an open dialogue, completely non-judgmental. This is also why, and again, I'm a parent, so I can say this, my own kids did not want help from me either. So outsourcing to a third party can be really helpful for this kind of thing because you can remain objective. And what you do is you just keep providing, an appropriate amount of support, but not too much. You try not to enable, excessive, I don't know, I don't want to use the word neediness, but I'm at a lack for another word right now, on the part of the student. And eventually, when they see what happens with these choices, they will start to kind of move their direction a little bit.
And part of that is developing routines and systems. We've all heard of like this hack or that hack or this very best strategy. But all those little things don't really work in the big picture. It's not just one thing. It's not, one strategy that you can do that fixes everything. When we're working with kids on things like being organized and turning their work in, really what gets to the crux of that issue, in addition to empathetic communication, of course, is setting up systems, not just one thing, but really having a routine that continues on and on. What are some systems that families can develop in their homes?
Yeah, this one is so important. And again, all of these things tie together. But if you come up with the system together as a whole family and everyone has ownership and everyone is a part of it, it's much more likely to get buy-in from your children, right? And also, let's say, for example, that my son played baseball nonstop, right? Family dinners were really hard to put together because we always seemed to be on a baseball field at some point. But we made sure to carve out, when it was high season, 2 times a week that we all agreed we could sit down at the table. And it might not have been till 8 o'clock at night, which wasn't ideal, but it was a time that we all agreed we could be there together. So anytime you can do that and come up with a system that assists or helps everyone in the family, that's when you're going to get more buy-in. And again, the autonomy piece is there again. And I know you and I were chatting yesterday about having been past teachers, of course, and I was sharing a story when I first started teaching. My first job was in 3rd grade. It was probably my very first day of school, and I had come up with a list of class rules. I created the list for the students. And the first 10 days or so of school go by, and I'm thinking, this is great, but my classroom management isn't so great. I wonder what's going on. And my mentor teacher came in and she sat down with me and she said, have you thought about letting the students create the list of rules? And to be honest with you, I thought she was crazy. I said, that is never going to work. But I tried it. And sure enough, it was miraculous. So those little 3rd graders sat around and they came up with every little item you could think of that made the classroom a welcoming place, a productive place, a clean place. And it worked beautifully. And I'd never had a problem again. But it was because it was a system. They had part of, the creation of it. So there was ownership. And it was at a level that worked for everyone.
And systems also work really well when it comes to organization. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, this one's really important. So we can, any kind of work that we can do to help our students get motivated is incredibly important. But another thing that really needs to happen is if we can implement within our students systems for organizing their materials, whether they're digital or concrete, right? Their assignments, keeping track of things. Also, not just their academic responsibilities, but their sports schedules or their church meeting group or the theater production they're a part of. When we can help them to get everything systemized and organized and make that all habitual and something that's internalized, then you actually free up that precious bandwidth to access curriculum so they can be more motivated because all that chatter and chaos isn't in the way because you've externalized all that with organizational systems.
Yeah, that's so true. Systems make a huge difference. But above all, at the end of the day, Kathy, we really, really want to support our kids' interests because, in my experience, interest is a great motivator. Tell us a little bit about this piece of it.
Yeah, this one is, and you and I are on the same page with this one, right? This one is so important. I think you want, I mean, as all adults, right? We all have something about which we are passionate, something we love to do, something that's nerdy or daring or whatever it is, but it really helps to have some kind of interest. It's what drives us, right? It propels us. If we go back to that first slide of the definitions of motivation. So whatever your child seems to, what turns on his or her light, we need to support that. And what happens then is, let's say, for example, like in this picture, you have a child who decides he loves soccer. So on the soccer field, he's learning about teamwork. He's learning about maybe spending time or working with people that he doesn't necessarily like that much, but he's in it with them, right? He's learning about his own determination, that he does have skill, that he can manage this task. That builds confidence, right? And so if a student can look at themselves and say, hey, wow, I showed up for practice on time every day. I actually got a compliment from my coach. I helped my friend who was struggling with his whatever kick. I'm not a soccer player. But then that confidence can leak out into the classroom, right? So now you have a student who said, well, if I can do it on the soccer field, maybe I should try it in the classroom.
For sure. I remember the student I had who was I believe she was in eighth grade at the time, maybe seventh, but she was amazingly talented artist, and that's what made her tick. But school was hard for her, and she would get behind. And her mom thought, okay, if I take away all of her art supplies, she'll have more time to focus on her schoolwork. So every time she got a grade that wasn't ideal, her mom would take away her supplies. And we ended up having a conversation about actually letting her do more of that. Don't take away our supplies, sign her up for another art class. Because often what happens is when kids are really passionate about something, they see this as their way out. They see, maybe I can do this as a career. Maybe I can study this in college. And actually, fast forward, that's exactly what she ended up being as an art major in college. And it's what she loved more than anything. And that feeling of, okay, I'm good at this, I can get through that. And somebody else put a question in here about this. How do I help my child think about college when things are so difficult now? It is focusing on the strengths for sure, but we're going to delve into that. So I saw a bunch of questions in the chat. We're going to get into those in just a second.
Yeah, and I want to address one of them real quick though, because it caught my eye, and it was a Leslie who wrote something about, what do I do if my child's interest is video games, right? And this is one we hear all the time, and it's so important. And Leslie, I feel you, I hear you, because my son was the same way. But there's a couple of things that are really important. Again, it goes back to that, they're passionate about something, let them go with it a little bit, right? Let them, we don't know what's best for them all the time, right? So if that's an interest, we have to sort of, stop talking, stop saying no, let them try it. But you also don't know what's going to come out of that. Quick example, my eldest played video games all the time, started to get frustrated with some of the games. I wish the game had this. I wish the game allowed me to do so-and-so. He's a software developer now. I can't think that was a coincidence, right? So sometimes you do have to take a step back as a parent if it's not the interest that you want them to have, and let them try things out, because again, that builds the confidence and it generates an interest for them that they might pursue later.
Yes, for sure. I love that story, Kathy. Thanks for sharing that. What about meeting kids where they are at this point?
Yeah, this one is important for everyone, right? Parents, teachers, coaches, etc. But I think it's really important we have to build a roadmap for the student and with the student, right? Again, we're focusing on the effort, not the end result, not the achievement, etc. And when we work with students, we actually sort of do a very soft assessment of where are they on a continuum of readiness to be, to want to do this coaching or to work with someone for some support. And once we know where they are in that continuum, whether they're at the far left or somewhere along the middle, the coaches know how to inform the session and what types of approaches to take. So even as a parent, you want to know, if you know your child is very, very resistant right now and shutting down for something, you're not going to get them to sit down every night and write in a planner. So you're going to have to sort of hold your breath and take a step back and see where you can make some kind of progress, right? You've got to encourage the bouncing back piece. And I always do this using myself as an example, did it with my own kids, did it as a coach, and I would share stories of my own failure because no one doesn't fail at some point in their lives, right? And there's some quote, and I'm going to mess it up, but there's something about the only failure in failing is not trying again, right? So it's always a learning experience. And then the last one is we have to teach kids the benefits of leaving one's comfort zone. And again, if you can model this as a parent, do something that makes you a little uncomfortable and share that with the student. So if I'm working with a student who's got a strategy they've been using and they're still not quite performing where we know they could, or maybe even they're not quite thrilled with their own efforts, I might say, okay, so, you're telling me that you remember all of your assignments and you don't need any system to track or to write it down. Okay, so how's that going? And the student might say, well, it's okay, some days. And I said, well, what happens on the other days? Well, then I forget something, or then my mother gets mad, or then I get a grade that's terrible, and then I have to repeat the test. And so then we say, okay, so are you willing to maybe just try one thing that might be a little bit different? So you're not asking them to make a huge leap, but just stretch the envelope a tiny bit and see what happens. Invariably, they find success when they stretch the envelope, and that breeds confidence, and that breeds less anxiety, and then we have a positive cycle happening.
I like that, a positive cycle instead of what we often hear about the doom loop, Kathy.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, we don't want our kids to be in this doom loop where, a bad grade and then lots of bad reactions and they feel bad about themselves. They put forth reduced effort. Often we see that occurring, and that's why it's important to really shake that up and to really be that positive influence on kids.
Yeah.
I want to mention that all these things that we've talked about today are part of our executive function coaching, and they're part of our 4-step approach in dealing with motivation. And you can find out more on our website at ectutoring.com/executive-function. Kathy, thank you so much for being my guest this afternoon. You are just so fabulous, and I appreciate it.
It's my pleasure.
Let's go to questions in just a second. In the meantime, if you want to talk to Kathy, she is more than happy to talk to you. And this QR code is actually her calendar, and you can schedule a 20-minute call with Kathy. You can talk about your child. She can share information on our programs and see if it's a match for what you're looking for. Kathy would be happy to help. And also, Kathy, I know you have your email here, and parents can contact you that way too.
Absolutely.
Great. Okay, so let's take a look at the chat and answer some of these questions that parents have. And if I don't get to your question, feel free to email me directly. My email is Ann, ANN, @ECtutoring, and I will absolutely be sure to respond to you. Okay, so a couple of questions. Natural consequences. Somebody said, what if natural consequences don't work? Or the child is blaming you for natural consequences.
Okay, that's a tough one. And natural consequences, like I said, they are uncomfortable. They're uncomfortable for the parent. They can be uncomfortable for the student. I don't want to think that they won't work permanently. There may be some stutter steps along the way, right? But I think you have to keep doing what I mentioned earlier. You have to keep going to that kind of cost benefit analysis, right? So you've got to keep trying and saying to them, okay, you tried this way. It didn't fix the problem entirely, but maybe it moved the needle a tiny bit. So we're all about in the coaching is, baby steps and always moving forward, right? We don't say stagnant, but it's not going to happen in giant leaps and bounds.
Absolutely. And I think sometimes kids can be so resistant initially, like the example you gave with your son washing his pants. He might say, oh, I'm still good. I don't, need to do it. But, in the back of their mind, that did maybe resonate with them some way. They just may not admit it at the time. So I do think that, not negative consequences, but natural consequences do work. They absolutely do. They just may not seem like they do at first glance.
At the time.
At the time, that's right. And Nicole asked, do students also receive a copy of the session notes? And the answer is yes, if you want them to. My oldest son, he's a senior in college, and he has had a coach all through college, and he gets all of the session notes. And it's been so unbelievably helpful to him to have somebody on his side really helping him better manage his time, study more effectively. He did struggle a lot with motivation when he was younger, but, again, in college, you kind of get to do what you like. So, we mentioned interest is a great motivator. It makes things easier, but still developing systems and keeping up with systems is helpful. And seeing that feedback, in writing, I think is really helpful to students.
Yeah.
Let's see. Question. Okay. What about the student with lots of missing assignments? And you mentioned this earlier, Kathy, the student who says, I don't want to work with a planner. I've seen this myself with kids over the years. They'll say, oh, I don't need to do that. I can remember everything. And that tends to, for a lot of our very bright kids, it kind of works when they're younger, but it doesn't work when they're older. What about the student who really refuses, Kathy, and does have a lot of missing assignments?
Yeah, and you're exactly right. That can work. I mean, most of the students with whom we work are extremely capable, right? Extremely bright, extremely capable. And sometimes that's a detriment because they coast along. They don't really, when elementary school, they can kind of get by. And they're so savvy, they come up with their own compensatory strategies. But then the wheels come off the bus because you hit middle school or high school, and maybe they're being challenged academically for the first time, and now they have no systems in place. So for a student who's refusing flat out, once they start to see, you might say, so, tell me about, are you happy that you're here in a session? And they might say, no, I don't want to be here. And you might say, well, what's going on? Well, I'm tired of my parents are always nagging me, or I'm tired. So instead of saying, what should you be doing differently to better yourself, you could say, what do you want to see not happen? And the student says, I don't want my parents taking my phone away every night. Okay, let's use that as a motivating factor, right? And then again, the choice piece. So I get it. You don't want to carry a planner around. I understand that. What if, for example, you just kept a Google Doc open on your laptop? Every time you open that laptop, it's right there. No one sees it. No one knows you're using it. You throw one sentence in it in every class period. You close your computer, you walk out of the room. You don't have to, it's nothing extra that you're carrying. You have the laptop anyway. But the point is giving them some options. And again, finding something that they're willing to try, even if once or twice, as soon as they see that it's improving their lives in whatever way that is, they're going to be more willing to stick with it.
I do like that solution, or the system of keeping track of things in Google Docs. It's not perfect, but you're right. It does solve the problem for so many kids. And somebody kind of along those lines, Kathy, asked, can you share specific examples of a routine or system that works with students?
For organization, or were they more specific?
Yes, for organization, for managing time.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah. So that could be probably, we've done a webinar like that. That could be a whole nother long conversation, but really it comes down to, I like templates. So I like some kind of organizer, some kind of template. And, kids today, they like the digital version. So something digital and it's got to be repeated over and over in a very consistent way. So once you determine what the system is, so you ask the student again, paper or digital, whichever they want. And then, for example, there's one we use with students where they have to list what the task is and then how much time it's going to take them. And then very specifically on what day and at what time are you going to do that piece. So it's broken into manageable pieces. The time is there. So there's no confusion. Oh, I'm going to do it tomorrow. No, actually, you said you're going to do it on Wednesday at 7:00 right after dinner, right? So breaking it into something that's very structured, and over time, it becomes habitual, believe it or not. I know it's hard to accept when you're in the throes of the emotional frustration with your child, but the more you repeat things and the more things stay consistent, and any way you can weave in the whole family system, like we talked about earlier, that's going to make them stick even more.
Had good success as a parent with both my kids really planning the week on Sundays. So after dinner, we would just talk about, okay, what do you have going on this week? And it helped me a lot as a working parent because there's so many complicated factors, like who's going to bring who here, dropping off, picking up, all the extracurriculars. But it was also a time to say, what do you have going on in school? Do you have any big projects or tests? So that they could kind of think ahead about their week. Because what I found over the years is that students with ADHD, especially, they're kind of in the now. They don't really think about what's due on Thursday when it's Sunday. They just think about, how their day is going to be great, or maybe what they have due tomorrow. And so having that routine of maybe after dinner, we call that habit stacking something onto something you already do. That is a time that, everybody is thinking about their week. When my kids were little, we used to make that organization. So it was 15 minutes. I'd turn on loud music and everybody would do something to be organized, not just the messy kid, but, I would clean out my bag or, maybe the junk drawer, and they would clean out their backpacks, their study area. So you can also build in things like that on a regular basis.
Yeah.
All right. So let's see. How do you start to address motivational challenges and related issues when a child is in denial? Even when this teacher says, no, this is an issue, that the parent is getting complaints from the teacher too.
Yeah.
Do you have any strategies for working with the teacher, Kathy?
For working with the teacher?
Or just, what do you do when the teacher is telling you, hey, this is a problem, and the kid's saying, no, it's not?
Yeah. So that, that has to start with the student, I think, because if the teacher is recognizing it, undoubtedly the parents are also recognizing it. And that's where you get to that. So our whole model is based on something called the stages of change. And it is a continuum of readiness for habit change. And it's any behavior. It could be an adult who's trying to quit sugar, right? It's the same idea. But on a continuum, and picture a number line from left to right, when the coaches start to work with the students, or even you as a parent, when you're first talking to your student or the teacher, is through a series of questions, you can figure out where they are on that continuum. So if they are completely on the left side of the continuum in what we call pre-contemplation. So I don't have a problem. I don't know why my mother's making me sit here. School's going fine. I'm okay, right? That student is going to need a lot more encouragement and pushing along to get to the other end of the continuum. And that's where we start with, the coach knows where they are. That informs the session. So coaches aren't going to say to that student, for example, so what type of assignment tracking tool are you using? That student isn't ready to hear that yet. Right? So that coach needs to be very careful and start with really small pieces and moving the needle in little incremental ways. And I always say this to parents, it is a process, right? So it doesn't happen overnight. It does happen eventually, like any habit that you build, but you have to be, you have to stick with it. You have to be persistent.
Kathy, this is a question I think we can all relate to as parents. How do you get your child to ask for help? When they're clearly struggling, how do you get them to go to the teacher and say, can you help me with this?
Yeah, this is a really important executive function skill. And some of us we think, well, how hard can it be? Students are terrified of their teachers. I can remember parents, I thought I was a pretty nice teacher, and parents would say, oh my gosh, they're afraid of you. They don't want to ask you. So I had to, own that and acknowledge that. But
if somebody's afraid of you,
they said so, yes. So part of the executive function work is a self-advocacy piece. And that's something that coaches can work with the students on. And an example of how that might look in a session is, let's say the student is in the session, they're looking at the learning management system, and they see that there's a missing assignment. And then we always do what we call trust and verify. So the coach might say, okay, the student's going to say, oh, no, I did that. And the coach is going to say, okay, I believe you, but let's go look. Then they look. And in fact, the student says, oh my gosh, I didn't do it. Right. That's the opportunity for self-advocacy. So the coach is going to say, let's draft an email together. Let's write an email to the teacher. Sometimes they'll even give the student a template. This is the perfect type of email to send to your teacher to ask for the help that you need. It's okay to do that. Or let's arrange a time when you can reach out to meet with them after school. These are skills that for many students need to be explicitly taught. So I think when we assume that kids are okay just walking up to any teacher, they're not. And that was always my mistake, was just thinking, oh, it's no big deal. What are you so afraid of? Kids are really afraid and anxious about that. So we need to teach them, give them an actual template or a tool to do that so that eventually they can do it on their own.
I love that, Kathy. That's such an important skill later in life, too.
It is.
Especially in college. All right. So Tabitha says she has an 11th grader who's a year-round swimmer and swims 8 times a week. So really packed schedule. She wants to teach her daughter to be independent, but she can never do the little things like laundry because she's just feeling so overscheduled. How do what do you do with students like that are just kind of barely getting through the day? Do maybe you not, worry about the laundry and focus on bigger things? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I talk to a lot of parents that have students that are, very dedicated athletes and do things like that, till 11 o'clock at night, every weekend, et cetera. I think as a parent, you need to pick your battles there, right? Because obviously involvement in a team activity, in a sport, also super good for brain chemicals, right? If you have ADHD, those things are very, very important. So this might not be the time to say, hey, by the way, you have to do your own laundry also. I might let that one slide. But ways you can help with that too is do that kind of calendar that you talked about. Do a family calendar, map it out. When I would work with students on screen, we would fill out a grid with every activity they had, not just when is an assignment due, but when do you have hockey practice? When do you meet with your church group? Everything on the calendar. And then we'd be able to see what are the available open windows of time that are left. That's when you can, leverage that for something else like laundry or whatever else it is. But sometimes when we make it a visual for the student to actually see where there's white space on the calendar, that's a little bit soothing, and it helps the student say, okay, this is where I can have a break of time.
It's kind of that, like you said, the visual of seeing their calendar and their openings. Sometimes kids see, oh, wow, I actually have a lot of time. But sometimes it helps them to see, wow, I have to be like incredibly productive with my time because I have so little time.
Yeah, good point. Anne, too, you often talk about the weird windows, right? So this would come in there. So Anne has a saying where she talks about helping the students to see weird windows of time that they could get work done. So for example, driving to one of those sports events, you're an hour in the car. You could use that time to get some homework done.
Yeah, for sure. All right, so let's look at some of our other questions, Kathy. Let's see. We had so many good ones. Somebody said, oh, I have a swimmer too. Yes, many of us have really busy kids that are very accomplished. All right. What do you do when the teacher is kind of old school and maybe you have a child with ADHD who perhaps has a 504, but there's a teacher who's really kind of not understanding the issues?
Yeah. This one is tough. And I experienced this as a teacher, and I hear a lot of parents talk about this. I think the first thing to do is always to make an appointment to sit down with the teacher. And, because you don't want to be, again, we want it to be a conversation, not a confrontation, right? Even with the teacher. But you might want to say, like, can I share some pieces of information about my student that might help you to understand him or her better? And, a lot of people don't understand the intricacies and the nuances of ADHD and how it manifests. And so it's not just organization, inability to focus. Sometimes there are a lot of emotional pieces, impulse control, self-regulation, big emotions. There's a lot of other things involved there. So if you can kind of have a very gentle conversation with the parents, and maybe even say, these are things we do at home that help. Maybe you could try this in the classroom. And then, at the end of the day, and I don't always want people to elevate to the next level, but as parents, you do have to know that a 504 is a legal document that's designed to protect your child and make sure they can access curriculum. So if you've gone to the teacher, if you've, been polite about it and tried to sit down and have a conversation, and if things still aren't moving, then you might need to reach out to someone else and ask for, a refresher meeting on the 504 to make sure that everyone's on the same page with regard to the accommodations.
Awesome. Thank you, Kathy. All right. Well, we're just about at 2:00. So I want to thank you so much for sharing so much wisdom with us today, Kathy. And thank you, everybody out there, for your time this afternoon. I hope that you found this to be a helpful topic. There will be a survey that will pop up on your screen when you exit. And if you would be so kind to fill that out, we would really appreciate it. Please keep a lookout for our upcoming webinars. We have one on emotional regulation, which is such a great topic, especially for our kids with ADHD, and lots of other great ones. Thank you, everybody, for being a part of our afternoon. Have a great day and have a wonderful rest of your week.
Thank you, Anne.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.